At 2:14 a.m., her phone rang. The number was registered to a woman who had been missing for 11 years. She answered because that is the job. The voice on the other end was calm, and it knew exactly where 7 people were sitting in the dark, and it told her how to find them. It was right about all of it. This is Scar Howl. Subscribe and like before it starts. Let's go. The call came into the Calvert County Search and Rescue Coordination Center at 14 minutes past 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. Dessa Vorn was the only one on overnight shift. She had been awake for 6 hours already, working through a report on a trail rescue from the previous weekend, a straightforward operation, a solo hiker with a broken trekking pole and a twisted knee, located within 90 minutes, extracted without incident. The kind of report she could write in her sleep. Sometimes she had. The coordination center at 2 in the morning had a specific quality to it. The building was a repurposed ranger station the county had acquired 15 years ago. The modifications sat on top of a structure that had not been designed for them, which meant there were corners that still felt like what they had originally been. The deep window ledges built for watching weather, the wall-mounted gear storage in the main room, the heating system that ran hot near the vents and cold near the windows so that moving through the space was a series of small climate changes. Dessa had worked in this building for 12 years. She no longer noticed these things consciously, but her body had incorporated them the way the body incorporates everything it lives in long enough. She was at her desk near the west window when the call came in. In daylight, she could see the lower trails from that window. At 2 in the morning, there was nothing to see: the lights of the valley road in the distance, the dark bulk of the mountains against the sky with the particular deep clarity of October nights at altitude, and the full moon, risen 3 hours earlier, now high enough that it lit the top of the ridge with a white that was too definite for moonlight if you hadn't seen it before. She had learned not to look at windows in the dark. Looking at darkness does the same thing to most people. A pull toward what the darkness might contain. The imagination always more creative about it than the actual dark. She kept her eyes on the desk, on the report, on the material in front of her. Stay present to the task. The dark takes care of itself. She logged the call at 2:14 a.m. She noted the incoming number in her field notebook before she did anything else, because that is what her training had made automatic: log first, respond second, understand later. The notebook was a specific model she had used for 12 years, replaced when full, the current one already more than half used. She noted the number, the time, the date. Then she pulled up the active missing persons flags for the Calvert Valley region while the recording played. The number was registered to Anira Cass of 14 Marin Road, Calvert. She did not recognize the name. She would. The voice on the recording was a woman's. Clear and even, with no elevation of stress in it, the particular calm of someone who has already done the work of assessing a situation and has moved past the assessing into what needs to happen next. Focus, not urgency. The voice of someone for whom urgency is a waste of energy once the situation is understood. She gave 7 names. She gave a coordinate reading accurate to 30 feet. She described the terrain features surrounding the hiker's position: a downed spruce to the east, lying at an angle suggesting a wind event, the root ball still partially attached, a seasonal creek bed dry by October, navigable as a route but identifiable by its channel shape, a rock face to the northwest that would catch and reflect a flashlight beam from 300 meters, a flat reflective quality rather than a scatter. She gave the best access route for extraction, and she included a specific note about a section of trail that had washed out in the spring rains and would need to be bypassed to the left. The bypass was steep but stable. The footing was adequate if approached carefully. She described the condition of each hiker. Hypothermia in 2, both ambulatory but slow. Judgment compromised, requiring assistance and warming before transport. A sprained ankle in 1, her left, unable to bear full weight. A man named Greaves who had lost his boot somewhere on the descent and had wrapped his foot in his jacket sleeve to protect it from the cold. Mild exposure across all 7. Disoriented, not mobile without assistance. Not in immediate danger if extraction began within 2 hours. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Then it ended. Dessa sat with her hand on the desk and the recording still open on her screen and the missing persons database visible in the adjacent window. Nira Cass, female, 34 at time of disappearance, reported missing 11 years ago. Last known location, the northern section of the Calvert Valley in the area where the old-growth forest begins. Case status, unsolved. Investigating officer, Detective Hale Rain, retired 6 years ago. A thorough and careful investigator whose thorough and careful investigation had still ended in an unsolved designation. She pulled the active hiker registration database for the Calvert Valley. 7 registered hikers had not checked back in at the end of the previous day. She matched the names from the recording against the registration list. They matched, all 7. She called it in, organized the team, drove into the valley in the dark with 3 other personnel, following the access route the voice had described, bypassing the washed-out section exactly where the voice had said to bypass it. The bypass was steep but stable. The footing was adequate if approached carefully, exactly as described. They found the 7 hikers at the coordinate given within 30 feet, confirmed against GPS in exactly the condition described. Greaves had 1 boot and 1 jacket sleeve. The woman with the sprained ankle was sitting with her leg extended at the angle of someone who has learned not to flex it. The 2 with hypothermia were huddled together against the down spruce, which was exactly where the voice had placed it, angled exactly as described. None of them knew how they had gotten there. Not in the way people usually don't know I took a wrong turn and then another wrong turn, and before I knew it, I was somewhere I didn't recognize. What they described was different. None of them could account for their time from lunch onward. The last memory any of them had with any clarity was stopping at the eastern trailhead at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon. A group lunch. The flat rocks that made a natural rest point there, talking about where they were going and how far they expected to get by nightfall. And then a quality of blankness. They all described it differently, reaching for the words available to each of them, but every description converged on the same qualities. Not sleep, not unconsciousness, not fear, not even darkness exactly. Just an absence of time, a gap where the afternoon and evening should have been, and then the cold and the dark and the full moon above the tree line, and no understanding of how many hours had passed or where the hours had gone. They were transported, treated, released. All 7 recovered fully within a week. Dessa thought about them sometimes in the weeks that followed. She thought about that specific quality of what they had described the gap that was not sleep and not unconsciousness. She had heard people describe missing persons experiences many times. She had never heard anyone describe it quite that way, like the time had not passed so much as been held. Carefully, by something that intended to return it. She drove back to the coordination center in the gray hour before dawn and sat at her desk. She pulled up the report template. She considered what to put in it. She considered this longer than she usually considered her reports. Equipment malfunction. Unregistered device. Voice similarity. Inconclusive. She read back through what she had filed. It was a report, coherent, internally consistent. It covered the facts in the way they needed to be covered in a document that would be read by people with no framework for what she had actually heard on that recording. She thought about the other 3 investigators who had filed the same report before her. She thought about what it had cost each of them, the specific cost of choosing the language that could be filed over the language that was true. She did not know if any of them had gone back to the valley afterward. She suspected they had. She suspected that some things, once you have heard them, require you to go back. She closed the file. She sat for a while in the uneven heat of the coordination center, the window dark with the not yet dawn, the full moon now behind the western ridge, and the sky beginning its earliest pre-light shift. Then she picked up her field notebook and her jacket, went to her vehicle, and drove back to the Calvert Valley on her own time. She did not know yet what she was going to do when she got there. She only knew she was not done. She spent the first hour walking the perimeter road. This was not what she had planned. It was what her body required before it would settle into the actual purpose of being here. Dessa Vorn was a person who processed through motion. She had known this about herself long enough that she no longer resisted it. You cannot think clearly about a place you have not physically moved through. Understanding comes through the legs as much as through the mind. The perimeter road ran along the eastern base of the slope that bounded the valley on that side. County-maintained gravel, passable in most weather, occasionally closed in winter. In October it was fine, the gravel dry, the roadside vegetation brown and low, the way October made it at this altitude. She walked with her hands in her jacket pockets, and the valley opening on her left. The valley was not a remarkable piece of geography on any technical measure. It ran roughly 3 kilometers north to south, perhaps 1.5 kilometers wide at its broadest point, enclosed by mountains that were not the tallest in the range and not the most striking. But they had the specific functional quality of mountains that actually enclose a valley. They created a boundary, a container, a sense of inside and outside that more open terrain does not produce. The valley floor was meadow and scrub and seasonal creek systems that ran high in spring and narrow in autumn. The eastern slopes carried the main hiking trail network. The western slopes were steeper and less maintained. The valley floor connected them the easy territory between harder things. At the northern end, where the ground began to rise toward the mountain pass, the old-growth forest started. It had been old growth when this land was first surveyed, and it was old growth still, because the geography of the valley made it inconvenient to log. The access grades were wrong. The return on the cost of roads too low. So it had been left alone in the particular way that things are left alone when they are not worth the effort of interference. A century of non-interference. More. The trees at the northern boundary were old enough that the records of when they had been young were not records anyone had kept. From the perimeter road, in the early morning, the northern tree line was 3 kilometers ahead, visible as a dark edge, where the valley's open meadow gave way to unbroken canopy. The morning light came from the east, which meant it lit the meadow and the western slopes, but not the tree line, which sat in a shadow that was not exactly the shadow of the mountains. It had a different quality than simple shade. Dessa noted this and filed it under perceptual response rather than observable description. The category she maintained for observations that could not be rendered in measurable terms, and kept walking. She came back to her vehicle at the trailhead, took out her laptop, and opened the case file on Naracast. The file was thorough in the way cold cases accumulate thoroughness, supplemented over the years, annotated the way paper files use to accumulate handwritten notes in the margins. She could trace the history of the investigation through it, the initial report, the first search, the second search, the follow-up interviews, the periodic reviews, the final status designation of unsolved, entered by Detective Hale Raines 6 months after the disappearance. No evidence of foul play, no evidence of accident, no remains, no credible leads. Case remains open. Investigation suspended pending new information. No new information had come. For 11 years. Nira Cass had been 34 at the time of her disappearance. A doctorate in wildlife biology. A record of field publications described by colleagues as patient and exact, the kind of scientific writing that accumulates observation over a long time before making any claim. She had been conducting research in the Calvert Valley for 2 consecutive seasons before she vanished. Population mapping of a specific elk subspecies that used the valley's northern meadow as winter range. An understudied subspecies whose habits required long-period, minimally intrusive observation to document accurately. She was, by all accounts, exactly the right person for this work. Patient, attentive, willing to spend long hours at observation points without the distraction of urgency. Her research partner for the second season, a postdoctoral researcher named Killian Surt, had left for a 2-day supply run on the day she disappeared. He returned to find her tent standing and intact, her research equipment in its usual positions, her vehicle in the camp parking spot, her field notebook open on the camp table to the last entry she had written. The field notebook had been photographed and cataloged in the first days of the investigation. Dessa scrolled to the photographs. The handwriting was small and very precise, the handwriting of someone accustomed to recording significant amounts of information in limited space. Dense lines, minimal abbreviation. The notations of a person who takes accuracy seriously enough to write it out fully, rather than trust a shorthand that might be ambiguous later. The final entry was dated to the afternoon before Cillian Surt's departure. It read, in full, Observe the elk herd at the northern meadow margin from approximately 0600 to 0830. Herd movement consistent with previous documented patterns, eastern drift before midday, return to the meadow margin by late afternoon. The old cow traveling with a limp since early September appears to have improved weight bearing, looks more even, gait less compensatory. The calf born late this season is staying close to its mother but range is widening, which is normal for this stage. Weather clear and cold. Temperature at observation point approximately 4 degrees. Good visibility throughout. Afternoon spent at base reviewing October data against the September baseline. No anomalies in the population count. The bull from the northern group has been absent for 5 days. This is either migration drift beginning early or something else, and I cannot determine which without more data. The valley has started to feel like it knows my routes before I walk them. I find this less alarming than I would have expected. I find it interesting. I think I am being learned. I am not certain I mind. Dessa sat with this entry for a long time. She read the last 3 sentences again. Then she looked up at the valley through the windshield, the meadow, the northern tree line at the far end of it, and she read them again. I think I am being learned. I am not certain I mind. She understood why Hail Rain had included the photograph in the case file, but had not known what to do with it. It was not evidence of anything that had a category. It was not a distress signal. It was not a farewell. It was the notation of someone who had observed something in their environment and was recording it in the same careful language they applied to everything else they observed. The last thing she wrote was a data point she did not yet know what to do with. Dessa sat with the laptop open and the valley visible through the windshield, and she did not move for a very long time. She spent the next 3 days pulling every missing persons case from the Calvert Valley going back 40 years. The county archive had the older files in a digitized format that was functional but not convenient scanned documents from paper originals, image quality varying depending on the condition of the paper. She read through the blur and the occasional missing corner and the faded ink of reports that had lived in paper form for a long time before anyone thought to digitize them. She built her timeline in the blank back pages of her field notebook, case by case. 11 cases. 4 decades. All in the northern section of the valley, in or near the area where the old growth began. She cross-referenced the pattern 3 times before she allowed herself to treat it as a pattern rather than a coincidence produced by the small size of the dataset. The pattern held. All 11 were experienced outdoors people, not novices. Not people who had underestimated the terrain or overestimated their own capability. The specific combination of errors that accounts for the majority of missing persons cases in remote landscapes. These were people who knew what they were doing. A trail runner who had been working these mountains for 8 years. A botanist in her 3rd consecutive season of field research in the valley. A retired park ranger who had spent 30 years working remote terrain professionally and had come back to this valley every October for 6 consecutive years because she loved it, specifically this valley, in this season. An experienced elk hunter who knew the area well enough that he sometimes served as an informal guide for less experienced hunters in adjacent terrain. People who should not have gotten lost here. She read each case with the same attention, the same patience. She had been in this work long enough to know that the cases that seemed simple were often the ones that had been read too quickly, an explanation imposed early enough to prevent a more accurate one from emerging. She did not impose explanations on these cases. She read what was there. What was there across all 11 was a pattern of specifically capable people who had entered a specific geographic area and had not come back out. No bodies, no remains. In most cases, no equipment left behind in conditions that suggested distress or injury or sudden incapacity. The camps and base locations of the missing showed signs of orderly departure rather than abandonment. Gear stowed, equipment secured. Nothing indicating panic or emergency. Everything suggesting someone who had finished what they were doing and left, except that they had not left in any direction anyone could trace. The final communications pattern was harder to establish because the documentation was inconsistent, but she found the thread, and once she found it, she could not unfind it. All 11 of them, in their final documented communications, had mentioned something about the quality of attention in the valley, in different language, using the vocabulary available to each of them, scientific in some cases, casual in others, the slightly embarrassed language of people who know how they sound and are saying it anyway. One described it as the mountain watching him. One wrote that the forest had started to feel personal, which she knew was not a real observation, but she kept noticing it. One wrote to his wife 2 days before he was reported missing. I keep having this feeling that the valley knows exactly where I am. Not a bad feeling, just strange, like being very carefully noticed. She read that phrase and put her pen down. Then she drew a line from it to a note she had made earlier. I think I am being learned. 2 people, years apart, different backgrounds, different vocabularies, different reasons for being in this place. Describing the same quality of experience and language that was different in surface and identical in substance. She sat with this for a while before she moved on. She had been trained to resist the pull of pattern the way the mind wants to connect things, wants to find the narrative, wants to impose shape on what might be coincidence. She had learned to resist this pull, not by dismissing what the pattern suggested, but by requiring it to hold under examination before she acted on it. She examined this pattern. She stress-tested it. She looked for the cases that didn't fit and found that they fit better than the cases she had been treating as the center of the pattern. The pattern held. Every one of them. Every single one. The 3 prior contact instances she found buried in the supplementary documentation of 3 separate cases. 2 were deep in follow-up files, added months after the initial investigation by investigators who had taken the calls and then had the same problem she had. No category in any report they were authorized to file. The 3rd was in a supervisor's note attached to a case from 17 years ago, written in the specific language of someone who had decided to put something on record without deciding what to do with it. She almost missed it. She would have missed it if she had been reading efficiently rather than reading everything. 3 calls, 3 full moon nights, 3 phones inactive since the owners disappeared, 3 voices confirmed by family as matching the missing person, 3 instances of accurate emergency information about people who needed help in the valley specific enough, in each case, that the people in trouble were found quickly and recovered fully. And after each call, nothing. The phone went dark again. No signal. No further contact. No trace. She read the notes from the investigators who had taken these calls. She recognized her own uncertainty in their uncertainty, her own careful maneuvering around what could not be said, her own filing of the unphrased thing. Equipment malfunction. Unregistered device. Voice similarity inconclusive. 4 people had filed this report. She was the 4th. Each of them had been alone in a coordination center at 2 a.m. with a recording that could not exist. Each of them had sat with it and written the report the way it could be written. She suspected each of them had gone back to the valley afterward, or had wanted to, or had stood at the edge of this thing and made a decision about whether to step closer. She was stepping closer. She was already in the valley when she thought this, and she went further. She tracked down the family of Nira Cass through the contact information in the case file. A sister, still in the county. A mother, 71 now, in a care facility to the south. She called the sister first. Her name was Orla Cass. She answered on the 3rd ring. When Dessa identified herself and explained why she was calling, there was a silence with a specific texture to it, not surprise, or not only surprise. More like the quality of something arriving that has been waited for long enough that the waiting has changed shape into something else entirely. Orla had already been contacted. A department protocol for voice confirmation had been triggered by the voice match flag in the system, quietly, without anyone informing Dessa. Someone had called Orla 3 days after the rescue. Orla had listened to the recording twice. That is Nira's voice, Orla said. She said it the way she would have said it about a fact she had long since stopped needing to examine. Not similar to her voice, not close to her voice. That is Nira's voice when she is focused on something that needs doing, and there is no time to be anything except the person doing it. I have heard her use that register my whole life. When we were children and one of us was hurt, when our father was in hospital and she was managing the doctors because she was the one who understood what they were saying. That is not a voice I could mistake for another voice. And I am not mistaking it. Dessa asked if she wanted to know what the voice had said on the recording. Orla said, "She found people who needed help and she gave them the help they needed, and then she stopped talking, didn't she?" Dessa said yes. Orla said, "That is what she does. That is what she has always done." Dessa asked whether Orla had ever had any other indication in the 11 years since her sister's disappearance that Nira was in any form still present in the valley. The silence this time was longer. When Orla spoke, her voice had a quality Dessa could not immediately identify. Not grief, not hope, not relief. Something that had stopped needing to be any of those things and had settled into something quieter and more durable. 3 years after Nira disappeared, Orla said, "I drove to the Calvert Valley. I had never been there. Nira and I hadn't gone there together. There was no reason for me to go there specifically. But one morning I got in my car and I drove there, and I parked at the northern trailhead, and I walked up to the edge of the old-growth forest. I had no idea where the old growth was or how to find it from the trailhead. I walked directly to it anyway." She paused. "I stood at the edge for a long time," she said. "I had the absolute certainty, not a feeling, not wishful thinking, not grief wanting to turn itself into something more bearable. The absolute certainty that she was on the other side of that line. Not dead, not missing, not lost, not suffering and not waiting to be rescued. Just there. Still being exactly who she was, on the other side of something I couldn't cross." Dessa wrote this in her field notebook as Orla said it. She did not comment on it. She thanked Orla and ended the call and sat with the notebook open on her knee. The absolute certainty that she was on the other side of a line I couldn't cross. She sat with this for a long time. She thought about the difference between certainty and hope, and between certainty and knowledge, and between the absolute certainty Orla described, not a feeling, not wishful thinking, and the things Dessa had been trained to trust. She had been trained to trust observable evidence, documented records, the accumulated pattern recognition of 12 years in the field, the body knowing things the mind could not yet articulate. All of that training, all of that experience was telling her the same thing Orla's absolute certainty had told her. She is there, on the other side of something, not missing in any sense the word was designed to describe. She thought she was beginning to understand. Not fully, not yet, but the shape of it was there visible through the fog of everything she did not yet know. The way shapes become visible through fog when you stop moving toward them and simply wait for the fog to move. She drove to the trailhead and went into the valley. She walked Nira's routes. She had printed the full 2 seasons of field note documentation, the route maps sketched in the margins, the observation point locations with their specific coordinates, the detailed records of what Nira had seen from each location and how often she had returned to it and why. She walked the routes these pages described. She understood within the first hour that Nira Cass had known this valley in the specific way that sustained patient attention produces knowing. Not the surface, knowing of familiarity, but the deep knowing of someone who has been attentive long enough that the thing they are attending to has given up its structure, its internal logic, its reasons for being the shape it is. Walking these routes was like reading a long argument made through movement rather than words. Here is what this observation point gives you that no other point gives you. Here is how this information connects to what you learn from the next point. Here is why you return to this one specifically when the light is at this angle in this season. The valley had been Nira's subject, and she had studied it the way good scientists study things by giving it the time it required, which is always more time than you expect, and by remaining genuinely open to being surprised by it, which is rarer than it sounds. The valley in October had a quality Dessa could not immediately name. She was aware of it from the first morning she walked here. She was careful about how she described it, even to herself, because she had learned over 12 years in remote landscapes that the language you apply to a place shapes what you are able to see in it. Call a landscape threatening, and you will find the evidence of threat. Call it benign, and you will miss the dangers. The best language for a landscape is exact, observable, and held loosely enough to revise when what you are seeing requires revision. She noted in her field notebook on the third day. The quality of attention here is different from other remote landscapes I have worked in. I mean by this, something specific. The attention is not diffuse, the general quality of alertness that high-stakes terrain requires of anyone moving through it. It is directed. It is specific. I have the sensation of being observed by something that is interested in me in particular, not in the general category of human moving through landscape. This sensation is consistent across locations within the valley and has been building in intensity since I arrived. I note it as a data point. I do not yet know what it is, data of. She read back this entry and recognized in her own language the language of Nira's last field note. I think I am being learned. She was being learned. She could feel it. Not as a metaphor, not as a projection of her own state onto the landscape around her. As a thing that was happening, the way cold is a thing that happens when you are in it, the way wind is a thing that happens when the air moves against you. She came to the northern meadow at midday on the fifth day, brown with late-season grass, the creek reduced to its October line, the sky above it the specific blue of high-altitude autumn. At the far end of the meadow, 200 meters ahead, the old growth began. She had been in many forests. She knew forests the way she knew other field environments, through physical experience, through the accumulated specific knowledge of moving through them in varying conditions and seasons. She could read a forest the way she read a rescue situation, process the observable information, build a picture, act on it. The northern old growth of the Calvert Valley was not a forest she could read in this way. She stood at the meadow's edge and looked at it, and it did not yield to reading. What she could observe, she observed accurately. Old trees, very old. Trunks of a girth she could not have encircled. Canopy continuous and unbroken. The light inside it visible to a limited depth from the meadow, different from the light outside, in a way that could be explained by the density of the canopy and the angle of the October sun. These things were observable. The feeling of being observed back was also observable, in the sense that she was experiencing it and it was real. She noted it as real. She did not look away from it. She walked to the boundary. She stood at the line where the meadow grass ended and the first great roots lifted from the ground, the buried architecture of something that had been building itself for centuries. She looked into the forest. The light inside moved in the way light moves through very old canopy, slowly, in patches, shifting with the canopy's breathing. The way very old trees breathe when wind moves through them, which is not the way younger trees breathe. It is the slow, deep movement of something with deep roots and a long relationship with weather. She stood there for a long time. She did not cross. She was not ready to cross. She was not certain readiness was the right concept for what crossing would require. She wrote in her notebook, standing at the boundary, "She is not missing. She is not lost. The valley learned her and kept what was true about her, and she is still here doing what she always did." I do not have a category for this in any report I am authorized to file. She stood there until the afternoon light began to change the color of the meadow behind her. Then she walked back across it and drove home and took 3 days of personal leave. Before she left, she stopped at the county records office and requested copies of the terrain survey documents for the northern section of the valley, geological assessments, forestry records, anything that described the old growth specifically. She read through what they gave her. The surveys were technical documents, the language of people who measure things and record measurements and do not editorialize about what they find. The old growth in the northern section was documented as extraordinary by any measure of that word in forest ecology. The age of the oldest trees estimated at well over 800 years. The canopy continuity rare to the point of being essentially singular in this part of the range. The biodiversity of the understory had never been fully cataloged because full cataloging would have required extended disturbance of the environment, and the environment had been deemed too ecologically significant to disturb for the purpose of documentation. In a note appended by a forestry assessment from 30 years ago, the surveying ecologist had written, "The old growth in the northern valley exists in a condition of effective isolation from surrounding forest systems, having developed along its own succession path for a period long enough that the dynamics internal to it may differ substantially from what would be predicted from comparable stands elsewhere. Further research recommended. Further research had not been conducted. The notes sat in the archive. A recommendation made and filed and not acted on. Another piece of the record that could be read two ways depending on what you already knew. She read it twice. Then she drove home. She spent the 3 days listening to the recording. She listened to it more times than she counted. She had the information, every detail cross-referenced against the terrain documentation in the case files and the route maps. Every detail checked out. She was not listening for the information. She was listening for the voice. Dessa had developed over 12 years of listening to distress calls and rescue coordination recordings and witness accounts, the ability to hear what a voice was carrying alongside what it was saying. Voice is a strange archive. It records things the speaker is not intending to record: the state of the nervous system, the quality of the fear, the distance between what the person knows and what they are able to say about it. She listened for these things the way she listened for specific sounds in the field, not consciously cataloging, open, responsive, letting the body process what the mind did not yet have language for. Nira's voice on the recording carried certainty, not the performed certainty of someone who is managing themselves, maintaining a functional exterior over something less functional inside. The genuine certainty of someone who knows a thing from long experience. The way you know a place you have been in for a very long time. The way knowledge becomes the body rather than just the mind. It carried presence. The quality of someone fully in the place they are, not somewhere else in their thoughts. Not managing the gap between where they are and where they would rather be. It carried purpose. She was calling because 7 people needed help, and she could provide it, and she was providing it. Not from distress, not from a desire to be heard or found or acknowledged, from purpose. The same purpose she had always had, applied to a new form of the same work. Still doing what she had always done. She listened in particular to the moment in the recording where Nira named the man who had lost his boot, Greaves. Said with the same tone as all the other information, the coordinate and the terrain features and the condition of each person. She said his name the way she would have said the name of an elk she had been observing for weeks, not casually, but with the specific familiarity of someone who has been paying attention to a subject long enough that the name has weight. She knew his name. She knew the names of all 7 of them. They were strangers, people who had wandered into the valley 11 years after she had become part of it, people she had no prior relationship with. She had learned their names the way she had learned everything else about them. From inside the valley, through whatever form of attention the valley extended to the people moving through it. She had known them before they knew they were in trouble. She had been watching them the way she watched the elk herd, the way she watched everything in this place. With the patient, specific attention of someone who has been in a landscape long enough to know every variable and note every anomaly. Dessa listened to the recording in the early morning and late at night, while she looked at the route maps and while she looked at the photographs from the case file and while she looked at nothing at all. She listened to it the way she had once listened to bird song in a particular canyon during a rescue, not to identify the bird but to understand what the bird was responding to. Because the bird knew the canyon, had been in it longer than she had. And if she could hear what the bird was hearing, she could understand something about the canyon that she could not have accessed on her own. Nira's voice knew the valley. Not the way a researcher knows a field site. The way something knows a place it has been inside for a very long time, in a way that has no easy comparison, because there is no ordinary experience that produces it. She listened for the boundary between what Nira was saying and what she was carrying. She found it in the pauses, the brief intervals between pieces of information where Nira was not speaking and not hesitating, but simply present, inhabiting the silence the way someone inhabits a room they have lived in long enough that the dimensions of it are part of their body. The pauses did not have the quality of someone gathering information or choosing words. They had the quality of someone at rest. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. In that time, Dessa heard everything she needed to hear. On the 3rd evening, she wrote in her notebook, "The valley kept her, and she is still entirely herself. Still the person her sister described without hesitation. Still the person who wrote in her last field note that she was being learned and did not mind. The valley found her a new way to do what she always did. I do not have a category for this in any report I am authorized to file. Below this, she wrote, "I am going back." She requested a week of personal leave. She gave no reason, and none was required. She packed her camping kit, her field notebooks, the printed documentation from Nira's case file. She drove to the Calvert Valley on the morning after the new moon. The timing was deliberate. 2 weeks before the next full moon, enough time in the valley for whatever needed to develop. She set up camp on the eastern slope at the main trailhead. The sight line to the northern tree line clear, the valley floor visible in all directions. She had the specific economy of movement of someone who has packed and unpacked the same equipment in enough conditions that the tasks no longer require attention. They happen while the attention is elsewhere. She set up the tent and the camp kitchen and the gear storage in the time it took her to assess the immediate terrain around the site. Wind direction, drainage, sight lines. The route to the northern trailhead and the distance from camp to the meadow margin. She had brought 2 things she did not usually bring on field operations. The first was a second lantern, smaller than her primary one, the kind that runs for 60 hours on a single charge. The kind you keep on when you are not actively using it, that holds back the immediate dark without demanding you look at it. The second was a copy of all of Nira's field notes, printed and bound in the same format as the field reports she carried on professional operations, so that the physical weight of it in her hand felt familiar. She walked Nira's routes every day. She sat at the observation points Nira had used and watched the same things Nira had watched: the elk herd at the northern meadow margin in the early morning, the light on the western slopes in the late afternoon, the quality of the creek at its October level, the way the old-growth canopy caught and held the last of the daylight after the sky above the valley had already gone dark. Each observation point had been chosen for a reason. She understood this within the first few days of using them. Each one gave something the others didn't: a specific angle on the meadow margin, a particular view of the tree line where the canopy broke, a position on the western slope that caught the afternoon light off the creek and turned it into a reference point for watching the herd's movement against. These were not arbitrary choices. They were the accumulated decisions of someone who had spent 2 full seasons learning how this valley wanted to be read. Dessa was a person who learned landscapes quickly. She had been trained to. And she had trained herself further past what the training required, because in her work, learning a landscape quickly was the difference between finding someone and not finding someone. She knew trail systems and ridge lines and seasonal water sources and the specific signs of each kind of terrain difficulty. She was good at this. She was not used to a landscape already knowing her back. The sensation did not diminish with familiarity. She had expected it to. Had expected that the more time she spent here, the more the quality of attention she was experiencing would resolve into something mundane, something she could file as ordinary high-altitude awareness, or the specific alertness produced by extended solo time in remote terrain. It did not resolve. It clarified. Each day she spent in the valley, the attention became more precise, more legible, more unmistakably directed at her specifically. Not at the idea of her, at the specific person she was, with her specific roots and her specific rhythms, and the specific way she processed information and moved through places. The valley was learning her the way she learned landscapes, carefully, thoroughly, without hurry. The feeling of attention intensified with each day. She tracked it carefully, its consistency, its quality, what it felt like to be on the receiving end of it. She tried to be accurate. She was aware that human beings attribute intention to environments in ways that are not always warranted. That loneliness in remote places produces a desire to be noticed that can feel like actually being noticed. She held all of this, and she still wrote, "The attention is real, it is specific, it is directed at me in particular. I believe this the way I believe observable things, because I have been observing it for long enough that the observation is reliable." On the 5th day, she saw the elk herd for the first time, moving at exactly the time and in exactly the direction Nira had documented 11 years ago. The same drift and return, the same rhythm across the meadow. She sat at Nira's observation point and watched them for 2 hours without writing anything, and when they moved off, she opened her notebook and wrote, "The herd is here, the patterns hold. 11 years and the patterns hold." She thought about what it meant that the patterns held. The elk herd was not the same animals. 11 years had certainly changed the composition. New calves born, old animals lost, the specific individuals different even if the movement patterns remained. What held was not the specific animals, but something that organized them. Some relationship between this herd and this valley that was deeper than the individuals comprising it at any given time. The valley and the herd had an arrangement, she thought. The valley makes arrangements. With the herd, with the people it has been watching, with the 11 people whose cases sat in the county archive, marked unsolved. She was not ready yet to say what those arrangements were. She was still in the part of the evidence that required accumulation rather than conclusion. But she was building towards something, and she could feel it building the way you feel a shift in weather before the weather arrives. Something in the quality of the pressure. Something in the specific way the light falls. On the 8th day, she went back to the northern boundary. She stood at the line where the meadow grass ended and the first great roots began, and she felt the valley's attention on her with a clarity she had not felt at any other point in her 2 weeks here. She did not cross. She stood there and felt herself known by it. The specific quality of being known by something that has been learning you carefully, noting your roots and your rhythms, and the specific way you move through a landscape it has been moving through for much longer than you have. She stood there until she had taken in as much of that knowing as she could hold. Then she walked back across the meadow. That night she sat outside the tent with her coffee and wrote for a long time. She wrote about the 11 cases in the 3 prior contacts and her own. About Orla's certainty and Nira's last entry and the recording and the quality of the voice in it. About what she had observed at the boundary on every occasion she had stood there, and how that observation had changed across the 2 weeks she had been here, deepening rather than fading, becoming more specific rather than less. She thought about Dessa Vorn as the valley might be thinking about her, if thinking was the right word for what the valley did. 12 years of search and rescue work. The specific competence of someone who has managed high-stakes situations long enough that the competence has become structural rather than performed. The field notebook in her breast pocket, always the same model, replaced when full. The dark eyes that processed information quickly and held it without visible reaction until she had decided what to do with it. The contained quality of her. The specific way she had learned to be present in difficult terrain without making the terrain about herself. She was not a person who needed places to reflect her back to herself. She was a person who went into places to understand them on their own terms. She thought, maybe that is what the valley notices. The specific quality of attention that can receive what it has to offer without distorting it. She thought, I am not afraid of this. She examined this thought for the quality of performance. The specific way that people sometimes declare themselves unafraid as a way of managing what they are actually feeling. It was not that. She was genuinely not afraid. She was something else. Something in the territory between dread and wonder, where those two states meet when the thing producing them is large enough to produce both at once, and you are honest enough to hold both without resolving them into something simpler. She went to sleep. She slept well, which was its own kind of information. The full moon rose on a Thursday. She had positioned everything carefully. The tent on the high ground of the eastern slope, the sight line to the northern tree line unobstructed. Her field notebook open on the flat rock she used as a camp table. Her phone charged to capacity, screen brightness turned down, sitting on the same rock. Her coffee in the thermos that held heat reliably, because the October nights at this altitude were cold enough that the body's warmth budget matters. She ate dinner as the light failed. She watched the last color leave the western slopes. She watched the stars come out in the specific order they came out here, an order she had memorized over the past 2 weeks as a form of orientation. Not navigation. She did not need to navigate, but the kind of orientation that comes from knowing what sky you are under, from being placed precisely inside a particular darkness, rather than simply inside darkness in general. She watched the moon begin to lift above the eastern ridge, the full October moon. She watched it clear the ridge entirely and come into its full presence above the valley, flooding the whole landscape in the particular colorless silver of full moonlight that makes familiar places into different versions of themselves. Not better, not worse, more clearly what they are, in some register that daylight obscures. The valley at full moon was extraordinary. She had seen it in photographs before this, and photographs had not prepared her. The old-growth forest at the northern end was a different black under moonlight than it was in daylight, a deeper black, a more absolute black, a black that had the quality of depth rather than surface, the black of something that goes back further than the eye can follow. The meadow in front of it silver. The creek, a single line of light across the valley floor. The elk herd visible at the meadow margin, 7 or 8 of them, their breath visible in the cold, steady as they watched, the same moon she was watching from the other side of the valley. She sat at the entrance to her tent with her sleeping bag around her shoulders and her thermos in her hand. She watched the valley in the moonlight. She was patient in the way she had become patient over 2 weeks of walking Nira's routes, not the patience of someone waiting for something to happen, but the patience of someone already in the thing that is happening, present to it, not needing it to resolve into anything different than what it was. At 2 in the morning, her phone rang. She had not been asleep. She picked it up in the same motion she always used when a call came in during field hours. Automatic, immediate. The response of someone for whom a ringing phone at 2 in the morning always means something specific. She looked at the screen. She knew what number would be there. She had known in some part of herself that had been paying attention to all of this longer than the conscious part of her wanted to admit, since she had set up this camp 2 weeks ago and left the phone on the rock and kept it charged. She looked anyway. Because she was a person who confirmed observable facts before acting on expectations. Nira's number. She answered. The connection was perfect. No static, no signal degradation. None of the audio artifacts that remote valley locations usually produced on phone calls. The voice was clear and close and fully present, the way it is when the person on the other end is not far away in any sense that distance normally means. The voice was Nira's. She knew it from the recording, from the 40 or 50 times she had listened to it, but hearing it now, in real time on a call rather than a recording, was different in a way she could not have predicted. The recording was Nira doing a specific task. This was Nira simply present, at rest in a place she knew completely. The voice of someone who is not somewhere else in their thoughts, who is not managing anything, who is just there, where they are. Nira asked if Dessa was all right. Dessa said yes. She said it without thinking, which meant it was the honest answer, which also happened to be true. Nira said, good. The silence that followed had the quality of 2 people on either side of something large, taking a moment to acknowledge the size of it before proceeding. Not because they were hesitating, because some things are large enough to deserve acknowledgement before you move past them. Then Nira said, the valley has been watching you since you arrived. You already know that. Dessa said yes. She said, I've known since about the 3rd day. It became clearer after that. Nira said, it wants you to know something. Dessa said, what? A pause. Not hesitation. The pause of someone with all the time they need, choosing the language carefully, because the thing being said is important enough to say correctly, and language has limits that matter more at certain moments than others. Nira said, it already knows your roots. The valley was fully lit by the full moon, the meadow silver, the forest at the northern end, its absolute black, the depth black of something that goes back further than the eye can follow. The elk at the meadow margin stood still, their breath coming slow and even in the cold, unhurried, as if they had been waiting for this specific moment as long as the valley had. Dessa said nothing. She sat with what had been said, and she sat with the valley, and she sat with the full moon above all of it, and she let it be as large as it was. Nira said, I find that less alarming than you would expect. A pause. She said, you will too. Eventually. The call ended. Dessa sat with her phone in her hand. The thermos was still warm on the rock beside her. The elk had not moved. The creek was its single line of silver light across the valley floor. The old growth at the northern end was its absolute black, but it was a different black now than it had been before the call. Not more threatening, not less, more known. The kind of black that is not an absence but a presence. The kind of dark that is not empty but full of something that does not need to make itself visible to be there. The valley had said what it had to say. It had said it through the only voice it had that Dessa would have truly listened to, through the voice of someone who had come here with patience and attention and meticulous care for this specific place and the people in it. Someone who had been recognized by a place that recognized rarely. Someone who was still entirely herself on the other side of the line. Still the person her sister described without hesitation. Still the person who had written in her last field note that she was being learned and did not mind. Still doing the work. Still providing the care, still being what she had always been. In a form that did not have a category in any report Dessa was authorized to file, but which was real, which was present, which was exactly what it needed to be. She opened her field notebook. The moon was bright enough to write by. She wrote, "The valley does not take the people it keeps. It simply finds them a new way to do what they always did." She closed the notebook. She sat at the entrance to her tent with the sleeping bag around her shoulders and the full October moon above the valley and the black of the old-growth patient at the northern end of everything, and the elk at the meadow margin breathing slow, visible breath into the cold, and her phone in her hand. And the routes of this place already known, already mapped, already held somewhere that had been paying attention to her longer than she had been paying attention to it. She did not move for a very long time. She was not afraid. She found it interesting. She thought she might stay a little longer yet. If you made it this far, you already know what Scar Howl is. Hit subscribe. The forest remembers everyone who listens. It will remember you.